Good day and welcome to this session on Incident Response 101 entitled, Are You Prepared? I'm Gary Perkins. I'm joined by Chris Clements, both from CISO Global, the company that believes cybersecurity is a culture, not a product. We're going to cover essential components you need to have in place to ensure your organization is better prepared to handle incidents when, not if, the occasion arises. Thank you to each of you for joining us here today. I know that by planning in advance, you'll be more successful in dealing with the incidents in the future. We'll be happy to take your questions as time permits, and we'll circle back on any that we miss. However, please note there's a 1-minute delay between what you hear on the line and us having a chance of seeing what you've written in chat. Now, I'm super excited to be joined by Chris Clements here today. He's our VP of Solutions Consulting, and I have the pleasure of serving as a CISO for CISO Global. And each of us have over 20 years of experience focused on security. Both of us have seen repeatedly what works well and what happens when organizations are caught unprepared. So we're going to share all that knowledge with you and go a little more into depth in a few areas. Please understand, though, there's a significant amount of expertise that goes into ensuring you're prepared to deal with when an incident strikes, and we can't cover it all in this one session, but CISO Global is happy to work with you to set up an IR retainer, build out your IR plan, or conduct drills to ensure you're better prepared. The content from this particular session will be available afterwards, and if you're enjoying the session, feel free to tell your friends during or after so they can join as well. We've already shared some blog posts on this topic and expect to have more materials going forward. You can find it all for free at www.ciso.inc/blog. So now, aligned with these blog posts, I'd encourage everyone listening to do a very high level readiness assessment for incident response. That's how we're going to start out that session today, and ask yourselves the following questions as it applies to your organization. If your answer to any of these is no, I recommend you go out and fill those gaps as soon as possible. So here we go. First question. Do you have an incident response plan? And I should add on that, do you know where it is? Have you seen it recently? Has it been updated in the last decade? The second one is, do you have an incident response team? And that refers to if it's full-time, like dedicated, virtual, or on retainer. Question number 3 is, do you have incident run books for those most common scenarios and so that there's a consistent response to them? And number 4 is, do you conduct regular drills in your organization for common scenarios? So those are the 4 questions. If your answer to any of those is no, I recommend you put that on your list of things to do starting as soon as this week. Now, Chris, maybe you can expand on why it's important to have a plan or any of these things in place.
Yeah, so I mean, when we're talking about incident response, I mean, it's a tough topic, right? First and foremost, that anytime you're working with incident response, there's a good chance that whoever you're working with, it's going to be on their the worst day of their professional life. I mean, there's been a failure of some sort. There's the question of whose fault is this? Is there going to be blame placed? How severe is the outcome going to be? And unfortunately, I mean, this is an area where there's just so much minutia. And as you said, we're going to give you a good overview here, but there's so many details that go into being prepared for incident response that it's difficult, if not impossible, to cover everything that you could ever need to. I mean, things are going to go wrong, and you're going to find that you're unprepared in some way. So when we think about doing the best we can, especially establishing a baseline, I think the most important thing to me is having a pre-thought out set of steps that we could take. I think there's a term for that. It might be a plan. That sounds right for me. But including things, big things, making sure that you're prepared beforehand. Making sure you've got coordination between the responders, right? Some responders first action might say, "Oh, we got to nuke it from orbit. We got to wipe the server to make sure we eradicate it." Well, okay, maybe, but you've also just wiped all the evidence that you could potentially use. On the other hand, if you say, "Hey, we can't touch this in any way," you're actively being breached at the same time, right? So you just have to make sure that whatever course of action that the organization deems is the appropriate one for them, that everyone's on the same page with that. And that's, just kind of the overview that I would give.
Yeah, I certainly agree. There's that old quote that's been credited to a variety of people. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And that certainly is true in this case. Now, that incident response plan, I think we can walk through each one of these things. That incident response plan, I'd be pretty concerned if an organization, when they have an incident, is turning to page one of a 180-page incident response plan. I don't think you're going to be successful in dealing with your incidents that way. I think a lot of the value there comes from the questions and the discussions that are happening while you're building that plan. And then when that plan is built, it's probably better used to pass audits and things than it is to be used when you're under fire. But certainly it covers all the key components, the different roles and responsibilities, and there are many. I'm not sure that a lot of folks appreciate that there are so many different roles here. And while it's true that individuals can double up on some of these, if you're the one that's doing all of those roles, you are going to fail spectacularly. It's really important that you appreciate that each one of these has demands, whether it's the person who is performing communications or note taking or interacting with law enforcement, or your insurance provider, or legal or privacy. All of these different things have to be happening, and I think that plan is critical for that. So if you don't have a plan, you should get one. Any plan is going to be better than none. And then make sure that you're updating and improving it. It's a living document. So I think that's the key for the plan. I think, unfortunately, a lot of folks will focus too much on just building this plan and then not doing anything else. And I think that is also a crime. But I mean, that one's pretty obvious. If we go into the team, though, so I like to say you've got to have a team that is either dedicated, and let's face facts, unless your organization's function is cybersecurity, it's unlikely that you're going to have a dedicated team unless you're very large or have way more incidents than the average organization. So most organizations are going to have a virtual team comprised of people in their organization that have day jobs and doing other functions, but stop everything they're doing and focus on something when it happens. And then all organizations, I view, should have an IR retainer with another organization, even if you never use it, but having it available so that you can use it if you need to. And honestly, it's a sign of maturity. Even if you were able to handle the incident, a sizable one, reaching out to a third party for a second set of eyes, I think, is a sign of maturity. So your thoughts?
Yeah, and building on that, I mean, I think that's a key part of the preparation step of a plan, right? So the kind of the real truth of and unfortunately that we have this happen to us all the time. We'll get a cold call in from an organization that's thinks or unfortunately knows sometimes that they've had a cybersecurity incident, and they're like, we need help now. And our response has to be, okay, first we've got to make sure that we've got legal coverage in place, that we've got financial vehicles in place, that all of these things line up, and that just takes time. And people are busy enough already, and dropping this on them, one, it makes them miserable, but two, it delays that ability to get started. And on the other side of that, if we take a look at it technically, I think that an unspoken, well-known secret in the incident response industry is that if we get that cold call in from a customer we've never seen before, we're going to burn 20 to 40 hours of incident response time just getting access to the environment, figuring out what's going on, figuring out how things work, figuring out where we need to look for evidence, forensics, that sort of thing. And I mean, what's your experience? I mean, delays like that, how do they affect what we see in breaches?
Minutes and seconds matter in incident handling and response. It's critical to hit the ground running. So having that incident response retainer in place ahead of time, please go and do that, folks. Find a reputable firm. Certainly CISO Global can provide that service, or perhaps another vendor that you're working with right now, and get that retainer in place in advance, because you don't want to be having to sign agreements under duress, because you might be willing to fast track things because you're having an emergency, but the company that you're calling, they are not having an emergency, and they need to make sure that they are legally covered. Because if they were to start their work and cause damage in your environment, that would not, go well for anyone. So if you put that agreement in place in advance and figured out the T's and C's, terms and conditions, you can also provide an opportunity for that organization to gain that familiarity with your environment. And even if you don't provide them standing access in your environment, at least have that break glass process so that if in the event you need to, you know how they're going to get access into your environment to help you out. And as I said, the armchair quarterbacks after the fact that are going to review everything with a revisionist history, like hindsight's 2020. You were just trying to make the best decisions you could with the information you had available at the time. But somebody after the fact is going to go through and look at this and say, you should have reached out for a third party's assistance. And at the time, the person that was working on it thought they had things under control until it rapidly got worse because the attackers knew that you were onto them. And so they started to just destroy everything and cover up all the evidence. So yeah, Chris, you mentioned evidence. It is really important that you protect and ensure chain of custody as if you're going to court, even if you don't end up doing it, because otherwise that evidence is useless, right? It would not be admissible unless you can account for who had access to it, how it was obtained, and whether it was forensically gathered, right? So all of these things are things that you need to be thinking about in advance. Get these things in place so that when the time comes, you are better prepared. And I know that a lot of folks struggle with this because they say, well, we can't possibly know what we're going to face. So how do we prepare for it? Well, I think you prepare for the things that you can expect, and then you deal with the other things when they arise. But in my experience, even in large organizations, the most common cybersecurity incidents that you're going to face will fit into 13 categories or less. And so you should have scenarios for what am I going to do in the event that we get hit with ransomware versus something like extortionware. Do we have those backups and other protections in place? Do we have a policy on whether we pay ransoms or not? These are the kinds of things that you want to have those conversations with the different stakeholders up front. You do not want to do it when the clock is ticking.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that another thing that is important to acknowledge is that for a lot of organizations, they're in a situation where they don't know what they don't know. So, using your example before of like getting an IR retainer, hopefully you're working with an organization of the caliber that one of the things they're going to do as part of that process is say, hey guys, we need to make sure that if we're going to be effective at doing this, that we've got the logging capabilities in place, that we're even gathering information about what's happening in your environment. And two, that we've got some sort of reasonable retention on that so that we can actually go back. I've unfortunately been involved with ones where, we say, okay, let's take a look at the logs. And they say, what logs? And then other ones we say, let's take a look at the logs. And they say, oh, those roll every minute, right? And they overwrite themselves. And so it's like at that point, we're like, okay, we're playing on hard mode. Let's move on.
I totally get that. Another topic that's really important to understand when you're dealing with these incidents is notification requirements, including if you have cyber insurance and you want to make a successful claim. It's really important to read the fine print because in order to make these claims, they may require that you notify them in a particular amount of time. And they may introduce you to their hostage breach negotiator or the person or team or company that is going to be running the incident. And you want to make sure that you know at all times who is in control here, who is external facing representing your organization. And at that point, I would recommend that it's somebody from your organization rather than trying to outsource that to a third party. But they may require you to use a particular in-house. So there are different options here, and whether cyber insurance is the right option for you. Or something like I know that in our organization we offer Checklight, which comes with a $250,000 warranty. That's another option so that in the event that you have this incident and you're concerned about the rising costs associated with dealing with it, that you could receive some financial compensation. Sadly, money alone is not going to restore your brand and reputation and the kind of intangible impacts of cyber events, but maybe it'll make you feel a bit better.
Yeah,
Uh, on-
that's so important though, because I feel like, if we just say, hey, that's what we've got the cyber insurance for, or that's what we've got our cyber warranty for, that doesn't help your customer that's had their private information exposed, right? And that doesn't help your other customers that you can't deliver service to while you're going and restoring that. So we do need to keep that forefront in our mind as well, I think.
Yeah, and one of the other trends that I've seen in the industry, when you have an incident, once upon a time, people would try to cover it up. But increasingly now, there's this pressure on organizations when they're hit by an incident to notify publicly either the affected people or to regulatory bodies. And I have some concerns there because, of the folks that are listening here, who thinks that you should notify the people that you have an incident before you know whether you even have an incident for sure, what it is, how big it is, who's affected? Do you think you should notify before you've contained it and stopped it from getting worse? How about notifying them before you figured out how the attacker got in and closed that off? I would say that it's truly irresponsible to be notifying before these things are in place, because as soon as others out there know you're having a problem, there's going to be more attacks by opportunists taking pot shots, thinking that you're down on your luck and you may have left a hole that they can get in. So I'm not saying not to notify, but I think it's more responsible to do that once you know what's actually happened and are in a place to communicate something useful.
Yeah, two things I'd like to add to that is first, I'm sure you've gotten these before. You'll get notified by an organization that you were affected by a breach that they had, right? And you're like, oh, that's not great. I guess I should be on high alert. And then you read more of the notification. They say, oh, by the way, it happened 12 months ago. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, what are you supposed to do with that, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I think it's very important that we consider just the scale of forensic analysis that's going to be necessary, because in some cases they didn't want to wait a year, but it really took a long time to dig through and understand what was affected, for reasons you said. And the other one, this is kind of just a pet peeve of mine, and unfortunately I think it's unavoidable. But when you see these breach notifications, it's always, we had a cyber incident from this to this many people were affected, and that's it, right? And I get that. That's a legal thing. It's a liability thing. I don't know that we're ever going to move away from that. But if every breach notification you saw, because of the kind of the information we know intuitively, you say, yeah, someone clicked something wrong. It was a phishing link, right? But if 9 out of 10 breach notifications that we received said it was due to phishing, do you think as just companies would change their approach to how they protect and prioritize these things? Because I do. And I think we're being robbed of really useful information. And that's just a pet peeve of mine. Again, I think it's a digression that we're not going to be able to fix. But
That's interesting, because I did see, again, another stat that says 93% of the high-profile breaches originated with phishing. And then, that should be a topic for a whole nother webinar, what you can do to prevent, detect, and respond to those kinds of things. But I know that when I get these notifications from companies, either directly or in the news, it always starts off with, but don't worry, it doesn't seem to have affected a lot of information. And then, a few days or weeks later, they come back and say, it's bigger than we originally thought. And then comes along the mandatory, but don't worry, we take privacy and security very seriously. It's like, well, if you took privacy and security very seriously, maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation, even though I don't believe that any organization is immune to attack. But certainly some of these are preventable, right? I'm not confident that you can stop all phishing attacks. But if some of these organizations that are getting owned by having high and critical vulnerabilities facing the internet, I'd say that is avoidable, right? Just going back to what we were talking about, working through like a plan, team, run books, and drills. On the team one, if these folks are named in your incident response plan, I'm curious, do each of the people on that know that you're going to be calling them and pulling them into a room or onto a conference call when you have an incident? Is that in their job responsibilities? Are you doing training with them? And are you involving them on those drills that you're having on a regular basis, right? So I think that those are key components. And then those run books of how somebody is going to respond. I think that a lot of organizations, they may have a couple of run books, but the team probably isn't following them consistently. And I think that that's really an opportunity where you can continue to improve on these things and add things that are missing to them so that there's a consistent response, because it may not be that same person that's always responding in your organization, right?
Yeah, I think that's important that each person that is involved with it understand their expectations and their responsibilities. And coming back to what you said, have they done it before? These things need testing, right? There needs to be a regular procedure where you can say, hey, pull me the audit access logs for this particular user for the past 3 weeks. And that needs to be
and then you
something
find out that they don't exist, right? It's like test your backups, but yes, test your logging too, because
yeah.
as you said earlier, how often do they rotate? And that's why, again, seconds and minutes matter, preserving evidence and limiting the damage. But yeah, how often have you gone to find that there's either no logs, or you get in there and the verbosity of the logs is not what you expected, and it is not going to help you determine who did what when.
Yeah. That root cause analysis is so valuable, especially when you're looking for a lessons learned as far as what happened for an incident. Without knowing that, how do you really get better as an organization with being able to improve on that? And coming back to what you said with the backups, unfortunately, I've been involved in scenarios where an organization with known good backups, they knew the backups were clean, they knew they were intact, they ended up paying the ransom anyway, because they discovered too late that a backup and restore process that works swimmingly well for a server here and a server there, all of a sudden completely falls on its face when you got to restore 1,200 at once, right? So, I mean, if I'm a CFO and someone comes to me and says, hey, we either going to be down for a solid month, because that's really how long it's going to take, or you can pay this ransom. That's easy math for me, right?
It really truly is a business decision at that point, unless there's any regulatory or legal requirements that you do not. Yeah, and sometimes, as you say, it comes down to a question of math. And so, yeah, you mentioned the drills. You should be testing them. I've heard organizations that say they just don't have the time for doing it, or they've scheduled one, but leading up to that, people are too busy or have conflicts or don't get around to it. It's like, folks, you can't afford to not be doing these drills. And I would argue, and I might be on my own on this one, but as long as you got any benefit or lessons learned out of it, then it's worth doing. So even if you did something that amounts to a 5 or 15-minute tabletop, if you learned something out of that, like maybe you need to go and check what your SLA with your vendor is and how to reach them, and making sure you have that information up to date, then it's worthwhile. It doesn't have to be 4-day war games with external organizations. But I would say it's also a common thing to have these teams, the IT or security teams, just doing them internally. And I think that is not the right approach in all cases either. You need to involve the C-level, and you need to involve media relations, because they're going to have key roles when this goes down.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it needs to be right sized, right? Your example earlier of a 180-page response plan, I don't think that's appropriate for every organization, right? We need to have a balance of what's the risk reward in this scenario. But there are certain things, I think, baselines that are simply fundamental to your planning that you need to have covered. And I think, backup restore is definitely one of those.
Yeah, so again, all of this is focused on the preparation component of an incident response. I personally like to use the Pickerel model, which is preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. And in my experience, organizations often fail on the preparation and identification. And once the incident hits, preparation is out the window. There's lots of things that you wish you did or wish you had, but now it's too late for that. So they fail on the preparation and identification. I think that organizations have to eventually get through the containment, eradication, and recovery even if it's painful and takes a long time. And in some cases, you see organizations out there that never get put back together as they once were. And then after the incident, it's true, you referenced it, conducting that lessons learned. How often do we find that once everything is fixed, that the organization just goes back to their regular business and doesn't conduct that lessons learned meeting, which is not about finding blame. It's figuring out how you can improve, because it's tuition value. You paid a price to learn these lessons. Don't waste that, right?
Yeah, and I want to come back to something you said that I think is so important, is that identification step. I mean, when we hear about things like attacker dwell time in an environment, I mean, this is literally a time where they've got access to your environment and your data, and you have no idea. The reality is there are probably many ways that you could have identified that proactively. But if you don't have that identification criteria and capabilities mapped out to say, okay, we need to see if someone logs in from Seattle at 9 a.m. and then Florida at 9:05 a.m., right? That's an indicator that something may be strange. So making sure you've got both the capabilities to be able to do that in the first place, but you've defined that as part of a potential identification process of an incident.
Yeah, in my experience, one of the other things with identification is determining event versus incident. Just because it looks and smells like an incident doesn't mean it necessarily is, and that's why it's the organizations struggle to try to figure out what is the extent of this thing. Is it even real? And and it's that telephone game gone wrong, because you get some information second, third, or later hand, and you need to go back and evaluate the facts.
Yeah. Or even just signal the noise in what you're looking at,
Yeah, because before you mobilize that team that's going to basically drive the productivity of your organization down to nothing. And I guess the thing that concerns me is a lot of customers only are doing what they need to around cybersecurity after an incident, right? It's very common. I say that my job is helping people find religion around security before there's an incident, because afterwards it's very easy. But save yourself that trouble. Reach out to one of your peers that's had an incident and ask them what they would recommend. Because trying to go fly under the radar and convince yourself that you don't have something of value is not going to prevent you from becoming a victim. It's that preparation you need to have in place. So again, to recap, you need to have that incident response plan of whatever size. You can always improve on it. Just make sure you have something to start with. You need to make sure you know who that team is, and definitely recommend, because unless you're a cybersecurity company, and even if you are, you should reach out and have professionals that are focused on this full time, because they know what to do. Even though this may be the first time you've had to deal with an incident, we get these calls all the time, and the voice is a little bit warbling because they're tired and they're stressed and they're emotional, and they don't know what to do. But we get these calls all the time, and we do know what to do, right? So, and to have the team streamlining their activity with runbooks doesn't mean that you've got step by step, this is the only way to respond to something, but a basic understanding of the tools and the people at your disposal, and conducting those drills. But in addition to that, we mentioned a couple of times the roles and responsibilities is key, and then also things that factor in like cyber insurance and IR on retainer. What are we missing that's important? In fact, we talked about notification as well. That's a key component, making sure that you understand who you need to notify when, because there are, if you're a publicly traded company, for example, you have set timelines you have to notify by.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important for organizations to consider is their readiness, right? So if you are to go to the people responsible for your IT environment and you say, "What's our risk from a cyber attack?" and they say, "Don't worry about it, we're good," that's the wrong answer, right? The answer should be, this is the potential risk. This is the areas where we're doing well. This is the areas where we're falling short, and this is the potential impact, right? Because the reality is unless you can look at your business and say, we can do this without computers and without the internet, this is something that should concern you.
Yeah, risk is not an emotion, folks. It is a formula. It's probability times impact. What is the likelihood that we're going to have a ransomware incident? Say it's low, but the impact, if we do, it's high, then you should be preparing appropriately. And, there are prevention things you can do in the name of prevention for each one of these, but they're unlikely to be successful in every possible case. So you can't just focus on prevention. You have to be doing the detection and response as well. Right. So I think we're coming up on time here.
Yeah.
It went by so quickly, but I think I want to whet appetites for future sessions and leave some things and just focus on the preparation component, because I know there's so many organizations out there that are wanting for some of these basics, and we can help, right? But I do want to respect people's time today, as well as thank all of you for joining and hearing about incident response and what you need to do to prepare. I hope you enjoyed your time with us today, and you'll come back for our future sessions. And I'd very much like to thank Chris for sharing his knowledge. What's a very challenging area for many organizations. We covered a lot of ground in that relatively short amount of time. And we also have the expertise to assist you with your incident response needs. All you have to do is give us a call at CISO Global and let us demonstrate how cybersecurity is a culture, not a product. And have a fantastic rest of your day.